Hello, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we delve into a tale whispered across the vast, windswept plains, a story of profound resilience, unexpected courage, and a love that bloomed in the harshest of winters, a stark reminder that even when buried beneath the deepest snow, hope possesses an unyielding will to take root. Before we journey into the heart of this storm-forged bond, let us know in the comments below where you're watching from today. We cherish seeing our global family gather. And if you believe in the enduring power of second chances, in the quiet strength that can mend a shattered spirit, please take a moment to hit that like button. Now, settle in, draw your chairs closer to the hearth of your imagination, for this is the story of Ilara, the outcast teacher, and Silas, the lonely cowboy, a narrative etched in hardship and illuminated by an everlasting devotion. On-screen text prompt: like this video if you believe in second chances. Where are you watching from? Comment below. The train, a monstrous, smoke-belching beast, had disgorged Ilara onto the naked platform of Redemption Creek Station and promptly abandoned her, its receding chug a fading heartbeat in the encroaching blizzard. Redemption Creek was a cruel misnomer. The station was less a building and more a skeletal suggestion against the vast, unforgiving canvas of the Montana Territory. Snow, driven by a wind that moaned like 1,000 lost souls, bit at her exposed skin, finding every inadequate seam in her threadbare coat. She clutched a small, battered valise to her chest, its contents, a few precious books, a change of worn linen, and the fading photograph of a mother she barely remembered, all that remained of a life unjustly torn from her. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper accusations, the same ones that had hounded her from the town of Blackwood, accusations born of malice and a man's spurned pride. Her breath hitched, a painful, frozen sob in her throat. The cold was a physical entity, coiling around her, seeping into her bones, making her teeth chatter with a violence that shook her slight frame. Dust, or rather, ice particles, swirled, obscuring the already bleak horizon. Visual cue prompt: close up on Ilara's chapped lips, the ice forming on her eyelashes. A sweeping shot of the desolate, snow-swept station, emphasizing her isolation. She stumbled towards the semblance of shelter offered by the station's overhanging roof, but the wind, a hollow mourner, wept through the gaps in its decaying walls, offering no solace, only a more concentrated chill. Her legs, numb and treacherous, buckled. She sank to her knees, the valise slipping from her grasp, its contents spilling onto the snow-dusted planks, a small, leather-bound volume of poetry, its pages already stiffening in the frost. This was it, then. The end of a journey that had begun in shame and would conclude in a lonely, frozen demise. A single tear escaped, freezing instantly on her cheek, a tiny, glittering monument to her despair. The world began to blur, the howling wind a distant lullaby. Just as the grey veil of unconsciousness threatened to envelop her, a shadow fell across her. Large, dark, solid. Through the swirling snow, she perceived a figure, broad-shouldered, a man whose presence seemed to momentarily push back the storm's fury. Silas Thorne had come to Redemption Creek for the monthly mail and a few dwindling supplies, a journey he made with stoic reluctance from his isolated ranch nestled deep in the Whisperwind Canyon. He hadn't expected to find anything more than the usual emptiness that clung to the place like frost. Then he saw her, a small, crumpled heap against the grimy wall of the station, almost indistinguishable from a discarded bundle of rags, were it not for the chestnut hair escaping her thin bonnet, dusted with snow like a tragic halo. His weathered face, usually set in lines of quiet contemplation carved by solitude and the harsh land, tightened. He was a man of few words, his thoughts as deep and still as a mountain lake. He approached cautiously, his heavy boots making little sound on the snow-covered planks. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder, unused to addressing anyone but his horse and the occasional passing trapper. He knelt, his gaze taking in her ashen face, the blue tinge of her lips, the tremor that racked her body. He saw the spilled book, its title barely legible, Leaves of Hope. It seemed a cruel jest in this frozen wasteland. He saw the desperation in the slight flutter of her eyelids as she tried to focus on him. On-screen text prompt: what do you think Silas saw in Ilara in that first moment of discovery? Share your thoughts. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a profound, instinctual urge to protect. He had known loss, known the biting loneliness of a Montana winter, though his was a grief of a different kind, a wife taken by fever years ago, leaving his hearth cold and his words few. He saw not an outcast, but a fellow soul battling the indifferent cruelty of the elements of life. Without another word, he gently scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a child, her body terrifyingly cold. A faint sound, a mere breath of a word, escaped her lips, too faint to decipher, perhaps at a please for a no, born of fear. He adjusted his worn sheepskin coat around her as best he could, shielding her face from the driving snow. "You'll be warm soon," he murmured, the words a solemn promise against the wind's howl. The journey back to his ranch was a battle against the storm, Silas a bulwark against its fury, Elara a fragile burden in his strong arms. The landscape stretched out, an endless expanse of white, beautiful in its desolation, deadly in its embrace. He pressed on, his own discomfort forgotten, focused only on the precious, fading life he carried. The wind shrieked, but within the circle of his arms, a tiny spark of warmth, of improbable sanctuary, was kindled. The Whisperwind Canyon Ranch was a haven carved from the wilderness, a testament to Silas Thorne's unyielding spirit. The cabin, built of sturdy pine logs chinked with mud and determination, stood defiant against the raging blizzard. Inside, a stone hearth dominated one wall, and Silas, after gently depositing Elara on a thick bare rug before it, coaxed a hesitant flame into a roaring blaze. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, painting them with a flickering warmth that began to chase the chill from Elara's frozen limbs. Visual cue prompt, close up on the crackling fire, then pan to Elara, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her eyes slowly opening to the unfamiliar safety. She awoke slowly, disoriented, the memory of the biting cold a nightmare receding against the tangible heat. Her first sensation was the prickle of returning circulation, painful yet reassuring. Her gaze drifted around the small, sparsely furnished room. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs, a shelf holding a few well-worn books and some tin plates, a neatly made bed in the corner. It was a man's home, stark and utilitarian, yet there was an undercurrent of order, of care. And it was warm. So blessedly warm. Silas sat on the opposite side of the hearth, watching the fire, his presence a quiet, unobtrusive weight in the room. He didn't speak, didn't press her. When he saw her stir, he simply rose, ladled stew from a pot simmering over the fire into a wooden bowl, and placed it on a small stool beside her, along with a cup of steaming herbal tea. "Eat," he said, his voice still that low rumble, but devoid of any threat. "It'll help." Elara's fingers, still stiff, fumbled with the spoon. She was terrified, every instinct screaming at her to flee, yet her body craved the nourishment, the warmth. Who was this man? Why had he helped her? The men she had known, especially men of perceived power or position like Mr. Albright back in Blackwood, offered help only with an unspoken price. But Silas asked nothing. He simply existed, a quiet mountain of a man, his gaze mostly on the fire, occasionally flicking towards her with an unreadable expression that wasn't unkind. Days bled into a week. The blizzard raged outside, cocooning them in an enforced intimacy that was paradoxically filled with vast distances of silence. Elara's physical strength slowly returned. The fever that had threatened to take hold receded under Silas's patient, if unspoken, care. He'd leave fresh water, ensure the woodbox was always full, and prepare simple, nourishing meals. He never entered the small alcove he had curtained off for her, giving her a space that was unequivocally hers. In this sanctuary, Elara began to breathe again, not just the air of the cabin, but an air free from the immediate taint of fear and judgment. Her past was a cloak of dust and ashes, his quiet, consistent kindness was like a tentative spring rain, slowly washing away the grime. She would watch him, covertly at first. The way his large hands, calloused from work, could be surprisingly gentle as he mended a piece of tack or stoked the fire. The way he moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that spoke of a life lived in tune with the harsh rhythms of the land. His loneliness was a palpable thing, a shadow that clung to him even in the firelight, much like her own. She saw a faded daguerreotype on the mantelpiece, a woman with a gentle smile. His wife, she surmised. The source of the deep well of sorrow she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. Slowly, tentatively, Elara began to emerge from her shell. She started by tidying her small alcove, folding the blankets he provided with meticulous care. Then, one morning, Silas found her carefully mending a tear in his spare shirt, her stitches neat and precise. She flushed when he noticed, expecting a rebuke for touching his things, but he only nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Good as new," was all he said, but his voice was a shade softer. She began to help with small chores, her movements hesitant at first, then growing more confident. She swept the cabin floor with a handmade broom, her actions bringing a subtle shift to the space, a touch of feminine order. She found she could make a decent stew, adding wild herbs she recognized from her childhood. The silent meals became less strained. One evening, Silas returned from checking his meager livestock, his face etched with weariness. Elara had a pot of soup simmering and had even baked a small, dense loaf of bread from his dwindling flour supply. A comfortable silence settled between them as they ate, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. He looked at her then, a direct, searching gaze. "You have a name?" he asked, the question simple, yet holding a universe of meaning. It was the first personal question he had posed. She swallowed, her throat tight. "Elara," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "Elara Hayes," he nodded slowly. "Silas Thorne," he offered in return. The exchange was a bridge built across a chasm of silence and suspicion. Elara found her worn book of poetry, Leaves of Hope. One evening, when the silence stretched particularly long, she gathered her courage. Would you mind if I read aloud?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from sharpening his knife, surprised. After a moment, he gave a curt nod. Her voice, initially trembling and weak, gained strength as she read, the lyrical words filling the small cabin, a balm to the harshness outside and the unspoken sorrows within. Silas listened, his expression unreadable, but he didn't stop her. Night after night, she read, and night after night, he listened. The poetry became another thread in the tapestry of their shared solitude, weaving them together in ways neither understood nor questioned. He began leaving small, intricately carved wooden birds on the table for her in the mornings, a hawk with outstretched wings, a tiny, delicate wren. She would find them and a small, tentative smile would touch her lips. These were his words, his way of communicating what he couldn't voice. She, in turn, saved him the choicest pieces of her meager baking, or mended his gloves with a care that went beyond mere utility. Visual cue prompt, close-up of Elara's hand gently touching one of Silas's carved birds. A shot of them on opposite sides of the hearth, Elara reading, Silas listening, the firelight soft on their faces, the community, that shifting chorus of the wider world, was a distant echo, almost forgotten in the isolation of Whisperwind Canyon. Silas rarely spoke of the nearby settlement of Redemption, and when he did, it was with a certain grimness, hinting at its small-mindedness, its quickness to judge. This only reinforced Elara's gratitude for the sanctuary he provided, a fragile bubble of peace in a world that had shown her little kindness. Her scars, both visible and hidden, were still there, but in the quiet respect of Silas Thorne's presence, they began to feel less like open wounds and more like the sealed records of battles survived. Hope, much like the first stubborn crocuses of spring, was beginning to push through the frozen earth of her heart. On-screen text prompt, "Could you survive in such isolation? What act of kindness from Silas would mean the most to you in Elara's situation?" The iron grip of winter finally began to loosen its hold on Whisperwind Canyon. The relentless snows gave way to hesitant sunshine, and the mournful howl of the wind softened into a murmur. Icicles wept from the cabin eaves, their meltwater tracing paths like tears of relief down the weathered logs. With the physical thaw came an emotional one within the small cabin. Elara's health was fully restored, the pinched, haunted look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a quiet luminosity. Color had returned to her cheeks, and the simple, hearty food had filled out her slender frame. She moved with a newfound grace, a resilience that shone from within. She had even started a tiny herb garden near the cabin door, coaxing green shoots from the awakening earth. Her laughter, a rare and precious sound, was sometimes heard, often in response to the clumsy antics of a newborn calf or the sight of Silas attempting to disentangle himself from a playful stray dog he'd reluctantly adopted. The silence between them remained, but it was no longer a chasm of fear and uncertainty. It had transformed into a comfortable quiet, a shared language of understanding that needed few words. Their days settled into a rhythm. Silas would work the ranch, mending fences, tending his small herd, his quiet strength a constant presence. Ilara managed the cabin, her touch bringing a warmth and order that had long been absent. She would often walk to the edge of the canyon in the late afternoon, looking out at the vast, sprawling landscape, no longer with terror but with a burgeoning sense of belonging. The land was still wild, still formidable, but now it felt less like a prison and more like a protective embrace. One evening, Silas returned from a long day to find Ilara humming softly as she mended one of his shirts by the firelight. She had braided her rich chestnut hair, and a stray tendril curled softly against her cheek. He paused in the doorway, an unfamiliar ache in his chest. He saw not the desperate, frozen woman he had rescued, but a woman of quiet beauty and profound inner strength. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for years felt, for a moment, less acute. He knew he would have to go to Redemption soon for supplies. The thought brought a knot of apprehension to Ilara. The town represented the world that had cast her out, a world of whispers and judging eyes. She voiced her fear tentatively one evening. "Silas, when you go to town, do you think?" He understood her unfinished question. "Ain't no one's business but our own, Ilara," he said, his voice firm. "This is my land. You're safe here." His reassurance was a balm, yet a sliver of anxiety remained. The day Silas rode out for Redemption, the sun shone brightly, but a shadow lingered in Ilara's heart. She watched him go, a tall, solitary figure receding into the distance, and an unfamiliar sense of desolation washed over her. She busied herself with chores, trying to push away the tendrils of unease. It was late afternoon when she heard the sound of approaching horses, too many horses for Silas's return. A cold dread seeped into her bones. She stepped outside the cabin, her hand instinctively going to her throat. 3 riders were approaching, and the man in the lead was sickeningly familiar. Mr. Josiah Albright. His portly figure was expensively dressed, even here in the wilderness, his face set in an expression of smug satisfaction. He had aged, but the cruelty in his small, deep-set eyes was unchanged. He was the man whose advances she had spurned in Blackwood, the man who, in his wounded pride, had orchestrated the campaign of slander that had driven her from her teaching post, from her home, branding her as a woman of ill repute. Visual cue prompt, a dramatic shot of Albright and his men riding towards the cabin, Ilara standing alone, defiant but fearful. Well, Ilara," Albright called out, his voice dripping with condescension as he reined in his horse a few feet from her. "It seems the wilderness has not been so kind as to swallow you whole. Though, I must admit, it has added a certain rustic charm." His gaze roamed over her, insolent and proprietary. "I've been looking for you for quite some time. Caused quite a stir, you did, vanishing like that. Some even whispered you'd met a bad end." Pity. Ilara stood her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The fear was a cold, familiar serpent coiling in her stomach, but beneath it, a new ember of defiance, kindled by months of peace and Silas's quiet strength, began to glow. "What do you want, Mr. Albright?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, though a tremor ran through her. "Want?" He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Why, my dear Ilara, I've come to take you back. There are still matters to be settled in Blackwood. Debts to be paid. A reputation to be managed." He dismounted, his 2 companions, rough-looking men with mean eyes, remaining on their horses, their presence a silent threat. "You have no claim on me, Mr. Albright," Ilara stated, her chin lifting. "I am not returning to Blackwood." Albright's smile vanished. "Oh, I think you will. You see, a woman of your particular history needs guidance, protection, and I am prepared to offer it. Under my terms, of course." He took a step closer, his intent clear. He meant to assert ownership, to drag her back into the mire of shame and accusation from which she had barely escaped. Just as he reached out a hand to grab her arm, the sound of a lone rider approaching at speed echoed through the canyon. Silas. He appeared over the rise, his face a mask of stone when he saw the scene unfolding before his cabin. He urged his horse forward, dismounting in a single, fluid motion, placing himself between Ilara and Albright. He said nothing, but his presence was a thunderclap. His eyes, usually calm, now held a glint of cold, hard fury. Albright, momentarily taken aback by Silas's sudden appearance and formidable stature, sneered. "And who might this be? Your new protector, Ilara? A backwoods ruffian?" Silas's gaze never left Albright. "This is my land," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word a piece of granite. "The lady is under my protection." Ilara moved to stand slightly behind Silas, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. Later that night, after Albright and his men had retreated, vowing to return, Ilara finally told Silas everything. The story poured out of her, the respectable teaching position, Albright's unwanted attentions, her polite but firm rejections, and then the insidious whispers, the trumped-up charges of impropriety, the public shaming, her flight. She spoke of the hollow words of judgment, the loss of her dignity, the dust of despair that had settled over her life. Visual cue prompt, close up on Ilara's face as she tells her story, tears finally falling. Silas listening, his hand clenching into a fist, his expression hardening. When she finished, the only sounds were the crackling fire and her own ragged breathing. Silas remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. Then, he turned to her, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite name, anger, certainly, but something deeper, more protective. "He won't touch you again, Ilara," he said, his voice a quiet vow, more powerful than any shout. "This is your home now. He won't take you from it." "Not while I draw breath." In his words, in his unwavering resolve, Ilara found not just a promise of safety, but the foundation of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. The ghost of her past had intruded, but this time, she was not alone to face it. On-screen text prompt: how would you react if your past suddenly reappeared to threaten your newfound peace? Would you fight or flee? The days that followed were taught with a quiet anticipation. Silas and Ilara knew Albright was not a man to accept defeat easily. He would return, his pride stung, his desire for control unquenched. They didn't speak of running, the thought was an unspoken betrayal of the sanctuary they had built, of the tentative roots Ilara had begun to put down in the soil of Whisperwind Canyon. This was their ground, their stand. Silas spent his days fortifying what little needed fortifying, checking the sturdy cabin door, ensuring his rifle was clean and ready. His movements were deliberate, imbued with a grim purpose. Ilara, drawing on an inner reservoir of strength she hadn't known she possessed, went about her chores with a new resoluteness. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a fierce determination. She would not be a victim again. She would not let Albright extinguish the fragile flame of hope that Silas had so patiently nurtured. Word, as it always did in sparse settlements, began to travel. Albright, upon his return to redemption, had wasted no time in spreading his venomous version of Ilara's past. He painted her as a woman of loose morals, a fugitive from justice, and Silas as a fool, or worse, a man complicit in her supposed deceptions. The shifting chorus of the small town began its insidious murmuring. Some, quick to believe the worst, especially when it came from a man of apparent means like Albright, cast judgmental glances towards Whisperwind Canyon. The storekeeper, Jedediah Smith, a man whose opinions often swayed others, became noticeably cooler toward Silas on his next brief trip for essential supplies. Whispers followed Silas like shadows, questioning his judgment, his association with that woman. Yet Silas walked through redemption with his head held high, his quiet dignity an unspoken rebuke to their narrow minds. He bought his supplies, met their stares with a level gaze, and returned to the canyon, his resolve unshaken. The expected confrontation came on a crisp morning, the sky a brilliant, indifferent blue. Albright returned, not alone this time. He brought with him the two rough-looking men from before, and, more troublingly, the town marshal, a man named Henderson, whose loyalty was known to be swayed by influence and coin rather than by strict adherence to the law. Visual cue prompt, a tense shot of Albright, his men, and the marshal arriving, facing Silas and Ilara who stand together before their cabin, Thorn. Albright called out, his voice carrying an arrogant certainty. "I've come for what's mine. And this time, I have the law on my side." He brandished a piece of paper, a hastily scribbled warrant based on fabricated claims from Blackwood, facilitated by Albright's money. Silas stepped forward, Ilara a pace behind him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent gesture of solidarity. "She's committed no crime on my land, Marshal," Silas stated, his voice calm but firm, addressing Henderson directly, pointedly ignoring Albright. "This is a civil matter from another territory, if it's anything at all now, Thorn," Marshal Henderson began, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to defy Albright. "Mr. Albright here has papers. Says the woman, Ilara Hayes, is a fugitive. Accused of theft and moral turpitude." Ilara felt a flush of shame, then anger. Theft? That was a new lie, more vicious than the last. But before Silas could speak, Ilara stepped forward, moving to stand beside him, no longer behind. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and carried a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. "Marshal Henderson," she began, her gaze direct and unwavering, "my name is Ilara Hayes. I was a teacher in Blackwood. I was driven from my home and my profession not by any crime I committed, but by the malicious lies of Mr. Albright." There she turned her gaze to Albright, who looked momentarily disconcerted by her direct accusation. "He pursued me with unwelcome attentions. When I refused him, he sought to destroy my reputation. The only thing I am guilty of is wishing to live in peace, free from his persecution." Visual cue prompt, close-up on Ilara's face, showing her newfound courage and conviction. Then a reaction shot from the Marshal and Albright. Albright scoffed. "Lies. She's a practiced deceiver, Marshal. Ask anyone in Blackwood." "Perhaps," a new voice cut in, firm and steady. Jedediah Smith, the storekeeper, had ridden up quietly, unnoticed in the tension. With him were two other townsfolk, a rancher named Martha Evans, a stern, respected woman, and young Timmy, the blacksmith's apprentice, whose mother Ilara had once given some herbal remedy to when she had accompanied Silas on a rare trip to town. "Perhaps," Smith repeated, "we should hear more than one side of this story. I've known Silas Thorn for years. He's an honest man, not one to harbor a criminal. And the lady, she doesn't strike me as a liar." Martha Evans nodded. "Mr. Albright, your eagerness to condemn this woman, to drag her away without a fair hearing even here, speaks more to your character than hers." Albright sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is an outrage. Marshal, do your duty." But Marshal Henderson was wavering. The presence of respected community members, questioning Albright's narrative, shifted the dynamics. He looked from Albright's furious face to Ilara's calm, dignified composure, to Silas's immovable stance. Then Ilara played her final card. From a small pouch at her waist, she drew out a small, worn, leather-bound diary. "This was my mother's diary, Marshal," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "And in it, I documented Mr. Albright's persistent harassment, his threats when I refused him. I wrote down the dates, his words. I wrote it for my own sanity, never thinking I'd need it as proof." She held it out. "It also contains letters from my former students and their parents in Blackwood, attesting to my character before Mr. Albright began his campaign." The tide had turned. Albright's bluster deflated. The so-called warrant looked flimsy against the weight of Ilara's quiet testimony and the tangible evidence of her diary, combined with the visible support from members of their own community. His hired men shifted uneasily. Marshal Henderson, seeing the shift in local opinion and perhaps finally pricked by his own conscience, cleared his throat. "Mr. Albright," he said, his tone now firm, "these are serious counterclaims. Without more substantial proof from Blackwood, and given the testimony here, I cannot, in good conscience, enforce this warrant on Mr. Thorn's property. This matter seems to require a proper investigation, not a forced removal." Albright's face contorted in fury. "You'll regret this. All of you," he snarled, but his threats were empty. He had been publicly discredited, his cruelty laid bare. He gestured angrily to his men, and they wheeled their horses around, retreating in disarray, their departure a stark contrast to their arrogant arrival. Poetic justice had been served, not by a court of law, but by the court of public opinion, swayed by courage and truth. As they rode away, the small group of townsfolk approached Silas and Ilara. Jedediah Smith extended a hand to Silas. "Thorn. Seems we misjudged." "Glad to see the truth prevailed." Martha Evans smiled warmly at Ilara. "You're a brave woman, Miss Hayes." "Welcome to redemption." Truly the shifting chorus had indeed shifted. They saw Ilara not as the outcast Albright had painted, but as a woman of immense courage and integrity. And they saw Silas, the quiet protector, as a man of unwavering honor. The wind, which had once seemed to whisper accusations, now carried a sense of cleansing, of new beginnings. On-screen text prompt: rate Ilara's courage from 1 to 10. What do you believe was the definitive turning point in this confrontation? A profound peace, deeper and more resonant than before, settled over Whisperwind Canyon. The threat had been met, not with violence, but with truth and courage, and their small world felt irrevocably altered, solidified. The bond between Silas and Ilara, forged in shared silence and tempered in adversity, no longer needed to be unspoken. That evening, as the sun dipped below the canyon rim, painting the sky in hues of rose and violet, Silas turned to Ilara. The firelight softened the rugged lines of his face, illuminating the warmth in his eyes. He took her hand, his calloused palm gentle against hers. "This is your home, Ilara," he said, his voice imbued with a quiet intensity. "With me." Always tears welled in Ilara's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming joy. "My only home, Silas," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The only one I've ever truly known," and in that simple exchange, a lifetime of love was acknowledged, a future pledged. They were married a few weeks later, as spring burst forth in a riot of wildflowers across the canyon. It was a simple ceremony, held beneath the vast Montana sky, officiated by a traveling preacher. Jedediah Smith and his wife, Martha Evans, and a handful of other townsfolk from Redemption attended, their presence a testament to the community's full acceptance. Ilara wore a dress of pale blue, the color of the prairie sky, a small bouquet of wild columbines in her hand. Silas, in a clean shirt and his best denims, looked at her with an adoration that needed no words. Visual cue prompt: a heartwarming shot of their simple wedding, surrounded by supportive community members. Close up on their clasped hands, exchanging vows, and so began their life together, a life woven from threads of resilience, respect, and a deep, abiding love. The years that followed unfolded like the pages of a well-loved book, each chapter richer than the last. On-screen text prompt: a visual montage begins, showing the passage of time. The ranch at Whisperwind Canyon prospered under their shared diligence. Silas's quiet strength found a joyful echo in Ilara's vibrant spirit. The cabin, once a place of stark solitude, expanded, room by room, filled with the sounds of a growing family. First came a son, with Silas's dark hair and Ilara's thoughtful eyes, then a daughter, bright and spirited, her laughter echoing through the canyon like wind chimes. Visual cue prompt: scenes of Silas teaching his son to ride, Ilara reading to her daughter by the fire, the children playing in the fields of wildflowers. Ilara, true to her calling, started a small school in Redemption. At first, it was just a few children gathered in the back room of Jedediah Smith's general store. But her passion for teaching, her ability to awaken young minds, soon drew more students. The small school grew, eventually housed in its own modest building, a beacon of learning in the growing community. Ilara Thorne became not just Silas's wife, but a respected matriarch, her wisdom and compassion sought by many. The story of their stand against Josiah Albright, of the quiet cowboy and the resilient teacher who faced down injustice together, became a local legend. It was told around campfires, in parlors, a testament to the power of truth and the enduring strength of love. Silas and Ilara were seen as pillars of their community, their lives a quiet sermon on integrity and devotion. They helped their neighbors, contributed to the building of a church, and saw Redemption grow from a struggling outpost into a thriving small town, its heart forever marked by their courage. Visual cue prompt: sweeping shots of the flourishing ranch, the bustling small school, Ilara and Silas interacting warmly with townspeople, the seasons turned, years melting into decades. Their children grew and found their own paths, carrying with them the legacy of their parents' unwavering love and resilience. Silas and Ilara grew old together, their love a quiet, steady flame that warmed their twilight years. Visual cue prompt: a tender shot of an elderly Silas and Ilara sitting on their porch swing, hands clasped, looking out over the canyon, their faces etched with the lines of a life well lived. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the shadows lengthen across Whisperwind Canyon, the silence between them as comfortable and profound as it had been in those first uncertain days. Sometimes, Ilara would take Silas's weathered hand, its strength still a comfort, and press it to her cheek. No words were needed. Their life together was a poem, written not in ink, but in shared sunrises, weathered storms, and the enduring landscape of their hearts. Their story did not end with them. It was whispered on the wind, carried down through generations, a reminder that even in the most desolate of places, love could blossom, and courage could forge an unbreakable legacy. The lonely cowboy who found a freezing teacher at a forgotten train station had found not just a wife, but a love that echoed through the canyons, a partnership that shaped a community, a story that became timeless. Visual cue prompt: a final, breathtaking shot of Whisperwind Canyon at sunset, the cabin a warm light in the distance. Their scars, once symbols of pain and isolation, had transformed into intricate maps of their shared journey, each line a testament to battles won, to love deepened. Their silences, once born of fear and uncertainty, had blossomed into a language of profound understanding, a quiet symphony only their hearts could hear. Ilara and Silas Thorne remind us that true sanctuary can indeed be found in the most unexpected of places, and often, within the most unexpected of hearts. They teach us that even the deepest wounds can heal, that a gentle hand and an unwavering spirit can chase away the darkest ghosts of the past. What did you find most inspirational about their story of courage, healing, and enduring love? We would be honored if you shared your thoughts in the comments below. And please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales that touch the heart and uplift the spirit. Until next time, may you find strength in your own silences, may your voice rise clear and true when it matters most, and may you discover a love that, like Silas and Ilara's, lasts forever, echoing through the canyons of your own life. On-screen text prompt: subscribe for more inspirational stories. What lesson will you take away from the lives of Ilara and Silas? Comment now.